Early one winter morning, a few days before Christmas, the mainline engines were getting ready for the day's work. From his spot in the shed, Bear glanced over at James. Since becoming a part of the Northwest Railway, Bear had proved himself to be a hard worker, willing to do any job that was required. Seeing this, the other engines had made him feel welcome. Well, all except James. Despite all that Bear had done, the red engine still disapproved of his presence on the railway. Bear had never really understood James's attitude towards him, but now, he thought, might be a good time to break through it. After all, it was the Christmas season, good tidings to all and all that. "Good morning, James," Bear said hopefully, as the steam engine's fireman got his fire going.
"Morning," James replied curtly, before steaming off.
Bear's face fell, and Henry glanced over. "Bear," Henry began. "I know, it's nothing personal," Bear replied. It wasn't the first time they'd had this conversation. "But I don't understand why he dislikes us Diesels so much. It's more along the lines of mistrust. Don't take this the wrong way, Bear, but we've had a rather nasty experience with the Diesel in the past." Bear frowned, slightly confused. "But you, Gordon and Alice don't seem to share the same attitude." "It happened before Alice got here. James has always been a rather proud engine, Bear, and that incident, well..." Henry sighed. "It's a bit of a long story, Bear. Just remember that it's not about you at all." "Thank you, Henry," Bear replied. Bear headed off to help Diesel with the yard work. Given that past history, he thought, he wouldn't try to change James's mind. A couple of days later, it was Christmas Eve. As usual, it was the busiest day of the year for the engines. Extra trains had been put on for goods, post, and passengers. Just after lunchtime, Bear was waiting at Knapford with one of those extra passenger trains. He glanced up at the station clock, noting he was due to depart in a few minutes, then looked over as a familiar figure stepped up next to him. "Hello, sir," Bear said. "Good afternoon, Bear. I'm going to have to ask you to take another extra train tonight." "What sort of run would that be, sir?" "An extra mail run, along the main line. It will be carrying last-minute Christmas mail." "No problem, sir." Before the Fat Controller could reply, the guard's whistle rang out. Bear's driver advanced his throttle, and the Diesel pulled smoothly out of the station. Bear made good progress along the line. It was snowing by the time he reached Wellsworth, and he brought his train to a smooth stop next to the platform. As the passengers were boarding, a familiar whistle rang out. It was James, and he wasn't happy. Strung out behind him was a train of trucks. He spotted Bear, and an angry frown crossed his face.
"How come you get to take passengers?" he complained. "You're a yard Diesel."
Bear didn't reply as James steamed by, in a huff. He was still in a foul mood when he reached Tidmouth.
"It's not fair,"
James complained, as he brought his trucks into the Tidmouth yard. Oliver glanced over from the coaling track. "What's not fair, James?" he asked.
"That Bear gets to take passenger trains, and I'm stuck on goods runs."
"We're all busy, James. It is Christmas Eve. I'm sure Bear's doing what he can to help out." James scoffed.
"I wouldn't trust a Diesel with passengers. In my experience, you can't rely on them."
Oliver scowled angrily. "Duck's told me about that experience. Tell me, James, are you really judging all Diesels by the actions of one, a couple of decades ago?"
"What would you know? You weren't there when it happened."
"As I said, Duck told me about it." Oliver sighed. "You're completely wrong about Bear, James."
"Oh, what makes you so—"
"What makes me so sure? I wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for Bear."
James frowned. What do you mean?
He turned a blind eye when he saw me escaping.
But you still ended up in a scrapyard.
Because I ran out of coal and had to stop on the main line. Believe it or not, James, not all diesels are bad apples. Before James could reply, Oliver chuffed off indignantly. James left a few moments later. That had been easy for Oliver to say, James thought cynically. He hadn't been there when Diesel had callously betrayed the trust of the 3 mainline engines. He'd arrived later, when the Diesels were taking over on the other railway. That thought brought a puzzled frown to James's face. Oliver had seen his brothers scrapped. He had more reason to dislike Diesels than James did, and yet he'd spoken up for Bear. Suddenly, James found he had a bit to think about. Later that evening, Bear arrived to collect his post train. Percy, Thomas and Oliver were already waiting with theirs, as the workmen loaded up the last of the letters and parcels. Due to the earlier snowfall, all 4 engines had been fitted with snowplows. Thomas glanced down at his buffer beam. Even though he'd learned his lesson about snowplows, he still wasn't a big fan of them. "Do we really need these?" he asked. "I mean, it stopped snowing ages ago." "I think it's just a precaution, Thomas. These vans are filled with last-minute Christmas mail, after all." On the other track, Percy chuckled.
Remember that time you had to get rescued by Terence, Thomas?
"I suppose you've got a point," Thomas agreed. Next to Thomas, Oliver glanced over at Bear. His thoughts turned to his earlier conversation with James. He was about to speak when a guard's whistle rang out. Bear's driver glanced back.
"That's us, Bear," he said.
He advanced Bear's throttle, and the High-Mech pulled out into the cold winter evening. Despite the heavy snowfall, Bear didn't have too much trouble along the main line. Smaller snowdrifts were easily brushed aside by his snowplow, and the larger ones had already been dealt with by a certain pair of Scottish engines. He was just approaching Henry's tunnel when Edward emerged, heading in the other direction. The blue engine whistled a warning as the trains drew closer. "Be careful, Bear! I think I heard some snowfall as I entered." "Thank you," Bear called back as he plunged into the tunnel. He could see the other end of the tunnel was half blocked by a wall of snow. As it had just fallen, he might be able to break through it. "Let's charge it, driver," he called. Bear burst out of the tunnel, sending snow flying. He chuckled as he continued along the line, then his expression turned serious. "Driver, we should probably warn them about that drift at the next station."
"That's Crofton's Gate, isn't it? We were due to stop there anyway," replied his driver.
As he continued along the line, a worried frown crossed Bear's face. He was feeling a bit strange after charging that snowdrift, and not in a good way. About an hour later, James was running light down the main line. He had just made his final run, and was heading back for the Christmas party. As he approached the station at Crofton's Gate, he saw the station master waving a red flag.
"What's wrong?"
James asked. "Bear was due in with a post special, about 3/4 of an hour ago. Edward last reported seeing him outside Henry's tunnel, and there's been no word since. We think he may have been stuck in a snowdrift. Can you keep an eye out for him?" James frowned. The last thing he wanted was to be delayed, especially by a diesel.
"Any real engine would know better than to get stuck in a snowdrift,"
he said, annoyed. From the narrow gauge platform, Skarloey looked over. "Do you really think he's not a real engine, James?" asked the narrow gauge engine. James didn't reply immediately. He had been thinking about what Oliver had said earlier.
"Actually, no, now that I think about it,"
he replied. He glanced over at the station master.
"I'll keep an eye out for him,"
he said, and chuffed off. He didn't have to go too far. A familiar green diesel was rounding the corner behind the works. Bear seemed to be struggling, but his engine was running as though he was going flat out.
Bear? James asked. The Heimek looked over, relieved.
James, I'm glad to see you. I'm afraid I've broken down.
Broken down? How?
I charged a snowdrift blocking Henry's tunnel. I got through that all right, but I think the sudden acceleration broke my torque converter.
You broke your what?
My torque converter. It sends the power from my engine to my wheels, like the piston rods for used steam engines. James was flabbergasted. After that sort of breakdown, he couldn't believe that Bear had managed to make it to Crowburn's Gate.
Do you need me to help you to the works?
I should be able to make it there from here. I mean, it's just another few yards. Could I ask you to take this mail train on? James was a bit surprised by this. After all, Bear was obviously in a fairly bad way.
Are you sure?
James, these mail vans have last-minute letters and parcels that people have sent to their loved ones for Christmas. They need to get through.
Okay, James replied. I'll take it on.
Thank you, Bear replied, relieved. He was uncoupled and slowly limped off to the works. A few minutes later, James had turned on the turntable at the works. As he moved off, the red engine found himself reflecting on what had just happened. Struggling on with his train like that was exactly what he would have done himself, James thought. Then there was the fact that Bear had helped Oliver all those years ago. All things considered, James thought, it seemed that he had misjudged Bear, and that he owed the diesel an apology when he got back from the works.